Well, before I start my personal explanation, you should know that there's a bust of Simon de Montfort hanging in the United States House of Representatives, or not standing in the United States House of Representatives. He's in the middle of that tremendous English tradition which gave birth to the United States of America. I mean, I call it a sort of a pragmatic individualism, but it's really the beginnings of democracy. And it runs from the Magna Carta through Simon de Montfort, Cromwell, and others. But the reason I found him was I have a son who's named Simon and a daughter who's named Harriet. And in the States, those are unusual names. And we would go to tourist shops, and there'd be the mugs and the keychains, and they would say, "Dad, our names are never here." I mean, they're my family names from the 19th century, which is why they're English. And then when I took my kids to London the first time, they went to a shop by the British Museum, and they were just so happy. They said, "There's Harriet mugs, there's Simon keychains." So I was looking for Simons to tell my son about. Somebody that was famous, and then I read about Simon de Montfort, and my jaw dropped because I could not believe I'd never heard of him. I mean, he clearly stands tallest in this Anglo-American tradition. He's an untitled French knight who landed in England, became the Earl of Leicester, and all the other native English noblemen asked him to take the lead in opposing the tyranny of Henry III. And, this king had replaced the curia with his French in-laws and siblings. It's kind of like Trump-like. And it's several times gone back on his oath to uphold the Magna Carta. Henry had sided with England's Gascon enemies, and he also overtaxed the people and the church. So the nobles rallied around Simon de Montfort, who had won military campaigns in France and the Holy Land. And here's an interesting aside. When he was in France, they asked him to be regent, and when he was in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, they asked him to be regent. It'd almost be like Germany asking Boris Johnson to run Germany. It was just an insane thing. He must have been one incredible human being. And then the king came after him. He defeated the king in Evesham, Lewis. He defeated the king in Lewis, and then he didn't do what I would have done or what many would have done, and he did not put a sword through the king and make himself king, even though he had two claims actually, by heredity to the throne. Instead, what he did is he set up a constitutional democracy, and I mean constitutional. The provisions of Oxford and Westminster were literally a constitution guaranteeing Englishmen rights against the king and rights in the court. It's an amazing story, and he had the first elected parliament with commoners. He stands right in that tradition that is so important to us as Americans as we look at England. And I also like to tell people, the American Declaration of Independence was written by Englishmen. They were born and raised in the English tradition, and they also wrote the Constitution. And part of that tradition, very clearly, is Simon de Montfort.
Almost as a reaction, I suspect. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the Declaration of Independence. England, particularly Britain, has a long tradition of an uncodified situation where we don't have that very strict set of the Constitution, which is a plus and a minus. We could have an entire show about that, I guess. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out that Simon de Montfort is actually quite a complex character. There are nuances to his character which are perhaps not very palatable to us now. Although there has been work on that suggests that actually, I'm talking about the anti-Semitism that's hung around him for a long time, but there seems to be more suggestion now that was more his mother, not him. Is that right?
I would say that, first of all, the instant that Simon de Montfort fell at the Battle of Evesham, there was a very extensive and coordinated campaign against his reputation. He was a darling of the church and of the common people, and there was a sort of groundswell to have him be named a saint, and there were other major people that supported him, but the royal family and their allies really worked against him for a long time, and they more or less buried his memory, which is unfortunate because he's one of the greatest Englishmen of all time. And I think that one of the hangovers or things that's continued on from there is the claim of anti-Semitism, which of course is correct. But to say that Simon de Montfort was anti-Semite is like saying that he was a man in the Middle Ages. I mean, generally that was happening. And if you look at the context, he's actually kind of not as bad as most of them. I mean, King John basically dispossessed the Jews of England, and Edward came in after Henry III and expelled them. And while they were headed out the door, many of them were murdered. But Simon's forces, his allies, his mother, his sons were involved in basically in pogroms. But there's almost, I've read 9 histories of de Montfort, and there's no evidence really that he himself was involved in any of that. The single thing we know that he did was he moved the Jews out of Leicester into a suburb that was run by his aunt, Margaret. And that's actually fairly tame considering what everyone else was doing. But this is where he really set the problem up for himself. He made this really vile statement about, how he and his ancestors would only be revered if he had done this horrible thing of expelling the Jews. So that statement was just terrible. And I think that's the thing that stands against him the most. But in many respects, I think, given that his own treatment was not as bad as what was going on around him, it may have been a political statement. He may have been saying that to assuage the virulent anti-Semites that he was, surrounded by.
So having sort of discovered him and then read about him, what made you want to write about him?
Well, I think it's a history that we all should know more of. And I mean, I'm surprised that when I speak to my many, many English friends, and unless they've gone to de Montfort University, as one of them has, they don't really know who he is. They've never heard of him. And when my American friends read about it, they just their jaw drops too. They just say, this guy is, he's a hero in the American style. He didn't usurp. He created this democratic government, and it reminds me of the time I was driving around Runnymede looking for the Magna Carta monument, and there was a dog show nearby, and I'd say, "Where's the Magna Carta monument?" And people would say, "We don't know, but the dog show's over there." And I finally found, I finally found it, and sure enough, it was paid for and built by the American Bar Association, the Association of American Lawyers, because to an American, the Magna Carta is the beginning. It's the statement of individual rights against the throne. And I think that what's happened for the last 8 centuries is that, the dog show of the English monarchy has sort of overshadowed the great history of Simon de Montfort.